If you're preparing for the Developing Solutions for Microsoft Azure exam, don't schedule your test before watching this video. Because in this video, I'll show you the important Developing Solutions for Microsoft Azure exam questions and topics that helped me pass the exam quickly. If you're planning to pass the Developing Solutions for Microsoft Azure certification exam on your first attempt, you're in the right place. This certification is offered by Microsoft, and it focuses on Azure Compute Solutions, Azure Storage, Azure Security, monitoring, troubleshooting, and connecting to third-party services within the Azure ecosystem. In this video, we'll cover important Developing Solutions for Microsoft Azure exam questions and preparation tips that can help you pass the exam quickly. Also, if you want the complete Developing Solutions for Microsoft Azure Practice Questions PDF from Study for Exam, the download link is available in the description.
Question 1. You are developing an Azure function that needs to run automatically every day at midnight. You need to configure the trigger for this function. Which trigger type should you use? A. HTTP trigger. B. Timer trigger. C. Queue trigger. D. Blob trigger. Correct answer. B. Timer trigger. Explanation. Timer triggers in Azure Functions allow you to run a function on a defined schedule using keyron expressions. For running every day at midnight, the cron expression would be 000 ****. HTTP triggers respond to HTTP requests. Queue triggers respond to queue messages, and blob triggers respond to blob storage changes. Question 2. You are building an Azure App Service web application. You need to store application configuration settings that can be changed without redeploying the application. What should you use? A. Environment variables in the application code. B. Azure App Service application settings. C. A configuration file stored in the application package. D. Azure Key Vault secrets only. Correct answer. B. Azure App Service application settings. Explanation. Azure App Service application settings are environment variables that are injected into application code at runtime. They can be updated through the Azure portal, CLI, or ARM templates without requiring a redeployment. They override any settings in configuration files and support slot-specific settings for deployment slots.
Quick exam. Tip 1 important thing about the AZ-204 exam is that it tests hands-on developer knowledge. Make sure you clearly understand these key topics. Checkmark Azure App Service. Deployment, scaling, slots, and configuration. Checkmark Azure Functions. Triggers, bindings, and durable functions. Checkmark Azure Blob Storage. Tiers, Lifecycle, and Access Control Check. Mark Azure Cosmos. DB, consistency levels, partitioning, and SDK's Azure API management, policies, products, and subscriptions, Azure Key Vault, secrets, certificates, and managed identities, Azure Service Bus and Event Grid, messaging and event-driven architecture, Microsoft Identity Platform, OAuth 2.0 MSAL, and managed identities.
Question 3. You are developing a solution that requires storing large amounts of unstructured binary data, such as images and videos. You need a cost-effective storage solution that supports tiered access. Which Azure service should you use? A. Azure SQL Database. B. Azure Table Storage. C. Azure Blob Storage. D. Azure File Storage. Correct answer. C. Azure Blob Storage. Explanation. Azure Blob Storage is specifically designed for storing large amounts of unstructured data such as images, videos, documents, and backups. It supports multiple access tiers including hot, cool, cold, and archive, allowing you to optimize costs based on how frequently data is accessed. Question 4. You are developing an Azure Function app. You need to pass data from an Azure Queue Storage message directly into your function without writing any queue reading code. What should you use? A. HTTP trigger with manual queue polling. B. Input binding for Azure Queue Storage. C. Queue Storage trigger. D. Azure Service Bus trigger. Correct answer. C. Queue Storage trigger. Explanation. The Azure Queue Storage trigger automatically fires the function when a new message arrives in the queue and passes the message content directly to the function parameter. You do not need to write any polling or queue reading code. Input bindings retrieve additional data when a function runs but do not trigger the function themselves. Question 5. You need to implement authentication in your web application so users can sign in with their Microsoft accounts. You want to use the Microsoft Identity Platform with minimal code. Which library should you use? A. ADAL, Azure Active Directory Authentication Library. B. MSAL, Microsoft Authentication Library. C. Azure SDK Authentication Client. D. Basic HTTP Authentication Headers. Correct answer. B. MSAL, Microsoft Authentication Library. Explanation. MSAL is the recommended authentication library for the Microsoft Identity Platform. It supports OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect protocols and works with Azure AD, Microsoft Personal Accounts, and Azure AD B2C. ADAL is the older library and has been deprecated in favor of MSAL. Question 6. You are developing a solution using Azure Cosmos DB. Your application requires that all read operations always return the most recent committed write, regardless of which region serves the read. Which consistency level should you configure? A. Eventual consistency. B. Session consistency. C. Bounded staleness consistency. D. Strong consistency. Correct answer. D. Strong consistency. Explanation. Strong consistency guarantees that reads always return the most recent committed version of an item. This is the highest consistency level in Azure Cosmos DB, but comes with higher latency since reads must wait for replication across all regions. Eventual consistency offers the lowest latency but may return stale data. Question 7. You need to secure your Azure App Service web application so that only authenticated users from your Azure Active Directory tenant can access it. What is the simplest way to achieve this? A. Write custom authentication middleware in the application code. B. Configure Azure App Service built-in authentication and authorization, EasyAuth. C. Deploy an Azure API management gateway in front of the appd. Configure a network security group. Correct answer. B. Configure Azure App Service built-in authentication and authorization, EasyAuth. Explanation. Azure App Service has a built-in authentication and authorization feature called EasyAuth that requires no code changes. You can configure it to require Azure AD authentication directly from the portal. It handles token validation, session management, and redirects to the login page automatically. Question 8. You are developing an application that needs to store and retrieve secrets such as database connection strings securely. You need to ensure the application can access these secrets without storing credentials in the code. What should you use? A. Azure App Service Application Settings. B. Azure Key Vault with a managed identity. C. Environment variables in the deployment pipeline. D. Azure Blob storage with private access. Correct answer. B. Azure Key Vault with a managed identity. Explanation. Azure Key Vault securely stores secrets, keys, and certificates. Using a managed identity eliminates the need to store any credentials in application code or configuration. The application authenticates to Key Vault automatically using the managed identity assigned to the Azure resource, following the principle of zero secrets in code. Question 9. You are building a solution using Azure Service Bus. You need to ensure that a message is processed by only one consumer even when multiple consumers are listening to the same queue. Which Service Bus feature ensures this behavior? A. Topics and subscriptions. B. Dead letter queue. C. Competing consumers pattern with standard queues. D. Message sessions. Correct answer. C. Competing consumers pattern with standard queues. Explanation. Azure Service Bus queues implement the competing consumers pattern by default. When multiple consumers listen to the same queue, each message is delivered to only one consumer. Once a consumer locks and processes a message, it is not visible to other consumers until the lock expires or the message is completed. Question 10. You need to implement a solution where different parts of your application can react to events such as a new file being uploaded to Azure Blob storage without polling. Which Azure service should you use? A. Azure Service Bus. B. Azure Event Grid. C. Azure Queue Storage. D. Azure Notification Hubs. Correct answer. B. Azure Event Grid. Explanation. Azure Event Grid is an event routing service that enables event-driven architectures. It can natively subscribe to events from Azure services like Blob Storage, Resource Groups, and Container Registry, and route them to handlers like Azure Functions, Logic Apps, or webhooks without any polling. It uses a push model unlike queue-based polling. Question 11. You are deploying an Azure App Service application, and you need to test a new version of the application without affecting production users. After testing, you want to switch traffic to the new version instantly. Which feature should you use? A. Azure Traffic Manager. B. Azure App Service Deployment Slots. C. Azure Front Door. D. Blue-green deployment with separate app service plans. Correct answer. B. Azure App Service Deployment Slots. Explanation. Deployment slots allow you to deploy a new version of your application to a staging slot, test it thoroughly, and then swap it with the production slot in a single operation. The swap is instant with no downtime, and the previous version remains in the staging slot for easy rollback if needed. Question 12. You are developing a containerized application and need to deploy it to Azure. The application is a single container and does not require orchestration. You need the simplest and quickest deployment option. Which Azure service should you use? A. Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS. B. Azure Container Instances, ACI. C. Azure App Service for Containers. D. Azure Container Apps. Correct answer. B. Azure Container Instances, ACI. Explanation. Azure Container Instances is the fastest and simplest way to run a single container in Azure without managing virtual machines or orchestrators. It is ideal for simple applications, task automation, and build jobs. AKS is for complex multi-container orchestration scenarios, and ACI is the best choice for single container deployments with minimal setup. Question 13. You need to implement API versioning in Azure API Management. Old clients should continue to use version 1, while new clients use version 2. Which versioning scheme should you configure? A. Header-based versioning. B. Query string-based versioning. C. Path-based versioning. D. Any of the above depending on your requirements. Correct answer. D. Any of the above depending on your requirements. Explanation. Azure API Management supports all three versioning schemes. Path-based versioning adds the version to the URL path such as /v1/products. Query string versioning adds a parameter such as $API-version equals 1.0. Header-based versioning uses a custom HTTP header. The choice depends on your API design requirements and client compatibility needs. Question 14. You are developing an Azure durable function that needs to coordinate a long-running workflow involving multiple activity functions. The workflow must wait for human approval before continuing. Which durable functions pattern should you use? A. Function chaining pattern. B. Fan out and fan in pattern. C. Human interaction pattern. D. Monitor pattern. Correct answer. C. Human interaction pattern. Explanation. The human interaction pattern in Azure. Durable functions is designed for workflows that require waiting for external input such as human approval. The orchestrator function pauses using an external event and waits indefinitely until an approval signal is received before continuing the workflow. This is perfect for approval workflows and escalation scenarios. Question 15. You need to optimize costs for Azure Blob storage. Data is accessed frequently in the first 30 days after creation and then rarely accessed afterward. Which lifecycle management policy should you configure? A. Move blobs to archive tier immediately after creation. B. Move blobs to cool tier after 30 days and archive tier after 90 days. C. Delete blobs after 30 days. D. Keep all blobs in hot tier permanently. Correct answer. B. Move blobs to cool tier after 30 days and archive tier after 90 days. Explanation. Azure Blob Storage lifecycle management policies automatically transition blobs between access tiers based on age and last access time. Moving to cool tier after 30 days reduces storage costs for infrequently accessed data. Moving to archive after 90 days further reduces costs for rarely accessed data. This balances cost optimization with data availability requirements. Question 16. You are developing an application that uses Azure Cache for Redis. You need to store user session data that should automatically expire after 20 minutes of inactivity. What should you configure? A. Set a fixed TTL of 20 minutes on each cache key. B. Use a sliding expiration by resetting the TTL on each access. C. Configure a Redis eviction policy to remove idle keys. D. Use Redis streams with automatic expiration. Correct answer. B. Use a sliding expiration by resetting the TTL on each access explanation. For session data that should expire after 20 minutes of inactivity, you need sliding expiration. This means the TTL is reset to 20 minutes every time the session is accessed. If no access occurs within 20 minutes, the key expires automatically. A fixed TTL would expire the session 20 minutes after creation, regardless of activity. Question 17. You need to monitor your Azure Function app and receive alerts when the function execution count exceeds a specific threshold. Which Azure service should you use? A. Azure Service Health. B. Azure Monitor with Alert Rules. C. Azure Advisor. D. Azure Security Center. Correct answer. B. Azure Monitor with Alert Rules. Explanation. Azure Monitor collects metrics and logs from Azure resources, including function apps. You can create alert rules based on metrics such as function execution count, execution failures, and duration. When a threshold is exceeded, alerts can trigger notifications through email, SMS, or webhook actions, and can even trigger automated remediation. Question 18. You are developing a multi-tenant SaaS application on Azure. Each tenant should have isolated data storage, but you want to minimize infrastructure management overhead. Which Azure Cosmos DB partitioning strategy best supports multi-tenancy? A. Use a separate Cosmos DB account per tenant. B. Use a separate database per tenant in a shared account. C. Use tenant ID as the partition key in a shared container. D. Use separate containers per tenant in a shared database. Correct answer, C. Use tenant ID as the partition key in a shared container. Explanation. Using the tenant ID as the partition key in a shared container provides logical data isolation per tenant while minimizing infrastructure management overhead. All tenant data is stored in a single container but partitioned by tenant ID. This is the most cost-effective approach for multi-tenant scenarios with many small tenants. Question 19. You need to implement a solution where your Azure function sends a message to an Azure storage queue every time it successfully processes a request. What is the most efficient way to implement this? A. Use the Azure Storage SDK to create a queue client and send the message in the function code. B. Use an output binding for Azure Queue Storage. C. Use an Azure Logic app to bridge the function and the queue. D. Use Azure Event Grid to route the function output. Correct answer, B. Use an output binding for Azure Queue Storage. Explanation. Azure Functions. Output bindings allow you to send data to external services like Azure Queue Storage declaratively without writing boilerplate SDK code. You simply assign a value to the output binding parameter and the function's runtime handles creating the queue message. This reduces code complexity and makes the function easier to maintain. Question 20. You are building a solution that uses Azure API management. You need to limit the number of API calls a single subscriber can make to 1,000 calls per hour. Which Azure API management policy should you apply? A. IP filter policy. B. Rate limit by key policy. C. Quota by key policy. D. Validate JWT policy. Correct answer, C. Quota by key policy. Explanation. The quota by key policy in Azure API management sets a renewable or lifetime call volume limit per subscription key over a specified time period such as per hour or per day. The rate limit by key policy limits calls per time window to prevent bursts but resets more frequently. For limiting total calls per hour per subscriber, quota by key is the correct choice.
If you want to practice more exam questions like these, you can download the Developing Solutions for Microsoft Azure Practice Questions PDF from studyforexam.com. The full PDF includes updated exam questions with detailed explanations, real exam simulation practice tests, coverage of all developing solutions for Microsoft Azure exam topics, Azure Compute, Storage, Security, Monitoring, and Integration questions, preparation materials for Microsoft Azure certifications. If this video helped you understand the developing solutions for Microsoft Azure exam, make sure to like this video, comment how many questions you answered correctly, subscribe for more certification exam preparation videos, download the Developing Solutions for Microsoft Azure Questions PDF from the link in the description. Thanks for watching, and good luck with your Microsoft AZ-204 certification.